This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of March 24th, 2025. Alongside my tag team partner, Matt Moscardi, I'm Damian Rollis on today's countdown. Tight lips but open wallets at Kroger. It's Groundhog's Day again for Verizon CEO Hans Vestberg. Half Moon Capital seeks the impossible at Dropbox. Maleficent curses Disney investors by pricking their fingers on a spindle and causing them to fall into a death-like sleep. Only a kiss from their true love, Nelson Peltz, can awaken them from their slumber. And on the big vote, Matt talks director political parties. That's a new one. Let's start with our top stories. For no particular reason, the Compensation Committee at Verizon Communications approved yet another increase to CEO and Chair Hans Vestberg's long-term bonus target. So 2 years ago, it was $14.5 million. Last year, it was $18 million. And now it's $25 million. And for some context here, last year, Verizon's total shareholder return ranked 92nd in the 92nd percentile among the S&P 100. Despite that, it resulted in only 25% of that award being subtracted because of that modifier. So
actually, important caveat here. Hans Vestberg famously, story broke, I think last year, about how Hans Vestberg meticulously kept a scorecard of his mood every single morning on a scale of 1 to 10.
Mood must be incredible.
Mood must be a 10 this year.
I mean, that compensation committee, Matt, has basically doubled his long-term pay. Doubled. I mean, you'd think investors would be paying attention to that one.
Maybe they saw his mood scorecard and they were worried.
Hyatt Hotels Corporation found its third woman for its board. Congratulations, Hyatt Hotels. Her name is Tracy Travis. Hyatt Hotels is led by father and son duo Thomas and Jason Pritzker. The Pritzker organization itself is impressively manly. The team consists of 28 people. Of the 11 women on that team, 11 women. 9 are either executive assistants, the receptionist, or the chef. The only ranking executive is Andrea Polumbit, the chief administrative officer, or the head of the executive assistants and the receptionist. So that's what's going on at Hyatt Hotels. The Hormel Foods board has given up on its CEO succession planning duties after CEO James Snee announced his retirement. Former CEO Jeffrey Ettinger has boomeranged back to the board to pick the next CEO. They created a new ad hoc CEO search committee to do a job that it didn't know how to do itself, I guess.
Well, here's a question for you. Most of these companies offer a stipend if you're on a committee. Do you remove the stipend from everybody on the nomination committee since that is supposed to be their job?
At a minimum, Hormel Foods investors should be targeting at least one director to vote out because that's a dereliction of their duties. While the Kroger company has still not divulged why it fired longtime CEO and chair Rodney McMullen, other than unhelpfully labeling his dismissal due to foul personal conduct. Although I added the word foul, they didn't even say that. We now know how expensive interim CEO and chair Ronald Sargent will be. He will receive an annual base salary of $4.4 million annualized for the duration of his service, and a stock grant valued at roughly $4 million that will vest fully in 1 year. Matt, maybe Rodney McMullen himself should be paying this salary, the interim CEO salary.
That seems a little socialist of you.
Okay. The board at U.S. Bancorp is down to only 4 women with an aggregate 4% of total influence after Kimberly Harris announced she was stepping down due to medical issues. So that data available only at freeflowanalytics.com. Only 4% of aggregate influence at U.S. Bancorp is held by women. Crown Castle announced that Dan Schlanger will become interim CEO after the termination of CEO Stephen Moskowitz. Dan tried to retire a few months ago, but the company is throwing almost $10 million just to stay on as interim CEO, including a monthly stipend of $100,000 in cash and over $9 million in equity.
Look, this is another case where what is the nominating committee doing? If somebody tried to retire, isn't your job to know who to replace them with? I thought that was the main goal.
Even worse, the guy stepping down, the CEO Stephen Moskowitz, he's been there I think for less than a year. So they've bungled just about everything in every direction. So again, investors should be targeting at least that committee to vote out at Crown Castle. Then I've been reporting about this every week in the Proxy Countdown in 2025. The number of boards who suddenly have only 2 female directors continues to increase. Molly Joseph is stepping down at First Solar, leaving only 2 women with 3% total influence. Remember, for several years, a minimum of 3 women was seen on most large cap boards, but we're seeing that rule kind of quietly be broken at the beginning of 2025 over and over and over. And lastly, at Intel, new CEO Lip-Bu Tan has quite a bizarre golden hello package, which could be worth as much as $400 million if he hits all his performance targets. As a part of this golden hello package, Tan will have to personally invest $25 million of his own money in the stock during the first 30 days in the job and hold it for the next 5 years, meaning he could potentially lose money, I guess, if he sucks at his job, I suppose. But this is a really strange golden hello package. Moving on to our proxy cage matches. Once again, we have a lot of stories. We skipped last week's show, so we have 2 weeks of proxy cage fights. Let's start with Dropbox. Dropbox is facing pressure from activist investor Half Moon Capital to end founder control of the company. I applaud that. A shareholder proposal submitted by Half Moon seeks to remove Dropbox's dual class share structure, which gives CEO and co-founder Drew Houston a voting supermajority. Unfortunately, Half Moon Capital, your proposal would require a majority vote approval, meaning Drew Houston's support would be needed for it to pass, because Houston currently has roughly 77% of all voting power because of his Class B shares, which are magically worth 10 votes a share. So good luck with
Houston
that.
Houston is 42 years old and worth $2 billion. And on multiple boards now, including, I believe he's on the board of Meta. Maybe he's just tired of running the company. Maybe that's what they're counting on.
Maybe it'll be a fat finger vote and he'll accidentally vote against himself. Outdoor goods company Yeti Holdings is adding 2 new directors after months of discussions with activist investor Engaged Capital. Engine Capital Management has nominated 2 director candidates for Lyft's board, signaling a potential proxy battle. A key point of contention there is that they're trying to get rid of Lyft's dual class share structure. So my question to investors at companies like Lyft and Dropbox, why aren't you asking for sunset clauses initially when you invest in these companies? How about we'll let the founders and CEOs have a dual class share structure for the first, say, 3 or 5 years, let them get settled in, but then these magical lucky charm voting provisions will disappear. It does
seem like reverse FOMO. I mean, the period, the run up of the tech bro and investment period was rife with dual class shares. That now I feel like everyone has buyer's remorse.
But then don't invest in a man usually who is insulated from you after you invest in him. Do not do that. How about that? Activist investor Keith Meister of Corvex Management will join the board of Illumina. Also, current board member Scott Gottlieb will become board chair. Carl Icahn and Caesars Entertainment reached an agreement in which two of Carl's buddies, both of whom are from Icon Enterprises, will join the Caesars Entertainment board. Carl Icahn is famous for only really putting his buddies on the boards where he's an activist investor. Cybersecurity firm Rapid7 added 3 new members to its board as part of a settlement with activist investor Jana Partners. And finally, a very confusing proxy battle between Phillips 66 and Elliott Investment Management. Phillips has now nominated 4 directors to the board after Elliott filed a lawsuit this week against Phillips, seeking to have 4 directors stand for election. Earlier this year, Elliott nominated 7 directors to the board. I don't know what's going on at Phillips 66, to be honest. Meanwhile, there's no turmoil in the CEO's office, as Phillips 66 CEO Mark Lashier is very happy. The company said that he will be paid $23 million in 2024, up 16% from 2023. I don't know how there's such a disconnect on this board. And I want to remind you that these are all large cap companies that I just mentioned. So we're seeing a little bit more activity in this in the activist investor proxy cage arena. Let's move over to our vote results table. We don't have a lot to report on. There actually are a lot of votes coming in, but I only highlight the votes where something's happening more than investors just approving everyone with a rubber stamp, which is most of the annual meetings. But let me highlight some dissent. Leslie's shareholders are mysteriously pissed off with nomination committee chair Yolanda Daniel, as 34% say no. It's a very high vote of dissent. But Matt, this is not a gender thing, as the Leslie's board is 5 women and 3 men. So maybe we're seeing a reversal. Maybe there's too many women on the Leslie's board. I don't know.
DEI vote, sure.
Yeah, I looked through the proxy statement everything I could think of, and I really can't see a reason why there's so many people against Yolanda Daniel.
We actually got a tip from a listener at one point when we couldn't understand it. So if you're listening again, maybe you have some insight into what the mystery was here.
Yeah, because it's often a story beyond what the proxy is presenting to normal investors and researchers like myself. At Sanmina Corporation, John Chevedden's shareholder proposal to give the owners of a combined 10% of common stock the power to call a special shareholder meeting passed, with 56% saying yes. That's a nice win there for John. Hopefully the board makes these changes immediately, because currently Sanmina Corporation shareholders can only call a special shareholder meeting if all the Sanmina directors are dead and or have otherwise left the board.
Really? So, is that what it says in the
bylaws? That's what John said in his proposal statement, in the proxy statement. Yeah.
That's fabulous.
I like that. I like that color there. At HEICO, the only 2 members of the board's nomination committee. I don't know how they're allowed to have only 2 members of their nomination committee, but that's the way it is. The only 2 members received high votes against. That's Mark Hildebrandt, 38% said no, and Alan Schreisham, 28% said no. And finally, at the Walt Disney Company, a company I highlighted at the beginning of the show, shareholders have decided that everything is good again now that Nelson Peltz and his merry band of white dwarf lovers has left the building. So just to put it into context for you, Matt, Maria Elena Lagomasino, a target of Nelson Peltz. So she got 92% support in 2023, down to 63% last year. And now, Matt, it is magically back up to 98% support. Suddenly, they love Maria again. And just for some other highlights to emphasize this point, Michael Froman, he went from 96% down to 87%, and now he's up to 99% this year. And Seon Pei, another example, 88% support in 2023, down to 78% support last year, back up to 89% support this year. So nothing has changed at Disney other than the fact that Nelson Peltz is gone.
First of all, congratulations to you. Forget Disney.
Go ahead.
Congratulations to you for what must be the most poetic opening line about Maleficent curses and investor sleep.
Matt, I couldn't think of any other reason why suddenly the Disney investors were disinterested. There was a lot to look through last year. We covered it extensively. You had Blackwell's, you had Peltz, you had Disney itself. There was a lot of room to maneuver. There was a lot of negative talk about policy, about succession planning, about pay, about certain directors. A lot of it was actually very healthy and very good talk. So I don't know what happened now that suddenly Michael Froman and Lago Messina now have about 99% support of all investors. Well, what is happening? How?
Look, ISS flipped their own assessment. They flipped.
Right? With actually no methodology, no performance data to support that flip, by the way.
All of the factors remain exactly the same. The only factor that is different is James Gorman is on the board, and he's supposed to be in charge of succession planning,
which makes no sense. He has no experience at board level succession planning, other than the fact that he stepped down at his own company and the board replaced him. That's it.
So, I mean, there's one of two operating theories here. It's that, ISS basically flips and there's enough drones who are voting just whatever ISS says, especially in the absence of Nelson Peltz and any sort of publicity, or investors truly never cared at all. They didn't even care last year. It was more with no other options. They just vote 98, 99% in favor of everybody because there feels like there's no other options. It's totally unclear to me how this is where we land.
Here's where ISS is missing out. I highlighted Michael Froman, who was magically up to 99% investor support this year, which is quite remarkable, even for the universe that we cover. Looking at the data at freeflowanalytics.com, Michael Froman has served on the Disney board for 7 years. So this data is not just the last few months. This is 7 years of data. He has the worst overall batting average on the board at a very low 275, including a paltry earnings batting average of 214. So there you go. There's some performance data that might suggest voting against a director at the Walt Disney Company. That's all I have. So let's hand it over to the big vote picks for the week of March 24th, 2025. I will highlight that there are 5 big cap companies up for a vote next week, April 2nd. The ones that I looked at specifically were TD SYNNEX, Cooper Companies, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, Photronics, and Schlumberger. But Matt, I don't know. I know that you want to unveil a new concept this week, so why don't you go for it? Director of political parties.
So I looked at the same exact companies, but let me say an upfront note before I even get into that, which is in the last week, there have been press releases, around 83 press releases of director appointments in just the last week. And I know we're ramping up in proxy season, but it's important to point out that those are 83 unelected representatives of investors,
circumventing
right?
actual shareholder democracy. Yes.
Those are chosen by management teams. They are appointed. They often get paid. There are some exceptions to that rule, but the vast majority of them get their options plans and their stipends, and they're put on committees, and they begin meetings before they ever get elected. Effectively, they are elected as an incumbent, even though they have not been on the board prior. So
basically daring shareholders to say no to a director who has already been appointed and sitting on the board.
So this is something that we pay attention to pretty closely because it's problematic. If you're an investor, you haven't vetted these people, you haven't approved these people, regardless of the fact that 96% of the time, 98% of the 99% of the time you're going to elect them. There's something to be said for assessing somebody before you elect them.
And let's not forget, Matt, that there's nothing preventing companies from actually presenting contested elections to their shareholders. They could present their short list and say, we have 2 openings. We found 4 highly capable potential directors, all of whom would serve our board well. We're going to give you an extensive biographies of all of the 4 nominees. We're going to give you the data from data providers like freeflowanalytics.com if you want to look at performance, if they've sat in other boards or currently in other boards. And we leave it to you. You decide who you think are the best options, right? I mean, that they are not prevented from this option.
they're not prevented from it, but it's not in their best interest to do it. But it's part of the reason why the lead into what I worked on this week, which was in the coming weeks we're going to air a interview I did with Sarah Hahn, who's a law professor at Washington and Lee. She looks at sort of the corporate democracy and is starting to look at why investors vote the way they vote, how the history of it, and how it overlaps with sort of the political democracy. So some of those overlaps include, she pointed out to me in the interview that we did that will air in a couple weeks, something to make it simpler in the corporate democracy would be effectively a version of a party system. There's multi-party systems all over the world in the political democracy,
Sure.
and you have sort of an alignment as a person with the values or ideologies or policy goals of those parties. Sometimes multiple parties you'd be fine with. Sometimes you're aligned with just one. But I thought, and she pointed out that this does not exist in the corporate democracy.
Right.
And it does not exist. Its non-existence makes it difficult for an investor sort of, when I say 83 announcements of director appointments, how do you parse those 83 people?
Right. As a real life example, if I haven't done my due diligence when I'm voting in a local election, if I'm a member of a certain party, I could just vote the party line. I could just select everyone who's in my favorite party, and knowing that they have been vetted through some kind of a methodology, right? Some kind of a belief system.
There's a very clear use case here for effectively a multi-party system in the corporate democracy that allows you to vote party line, where you can trust sort of their policy goals or their approach. Now, in the absence of knowing ideologically or policy-wise where a director stands, I wanted to test whether you could do this with data.
Okay.
So if you want to vote a slate of directors across companies like a political party, how would you do it? So
like the way this sounds, yeah.
Here's what I came up with. And this is just a test of a concept more than it is an end, right? But I wanted to think through what the process would be. So I came up with about 7 or 8 parties and a methodology by which I got to those parties. They're based on some demographics and some performance indicators of directors in the Freeflow Analytics database. Here's an example. One party I call the hands-on party.
Okay, meaning?
All right, these are directors who have gotten their hands dirty in as much as they are or were a CEO.
Okay.
They have core knowledge of the industry that they're sitting on where they're sitting on the board, right? That means
so they were an executive at a company in that industry.
They know that industry really well.
Right.
They did the work. And I added this little flavor, which is they've been through a global recession.
Why did you add that?
I added that because basically what you want is somebody who knows what the up cycle's like and what the down cycle's like. They know how to weather the storm. They get their hands dirty and they survived.
So you use tenure data for that.
So I'm using tenure data, and I mapped that tenure data to effectively the history of global recessions. That's an example. That's a very simple example of saying all right, well, these are some hands-on-y kind of people. Let's call it a party.
Right.
Here are the rest of the parties I came up with. There's an elite party.
Yes.
These are people that have advanced degrees or went to elite schools. And
sure.
Elite schools are defined by, there's any number of ways to define it, but it's basically the top 100 global colleges, right?
Right.
They've been on more than one board in the past 10 years. These are people who have sort of an elite status. They're multi-boarders, and they have a powerful network of friends. If you want to get specific, they're in the 75th percentile or greater in network power, according to Freeflow Analytics data.
Well, my initial question is, what happens if you happen to fall into both the elite party and the hands-on party?
So what I did for the purposes of this exercise is I effectively ordered them or ranked them. If you're in the hands-on party, you could have all those other things, but I'm going to call you hands-on, right? And not elite. Okay. So these are people who don't have they don't have all of the elements of a hands-on party member, who are left over.
Got it.
So in this way, I can identify you as one party. Now, that's an arbitrary rule, but we're doing it for the sake of sort of the argument here.
Sure.
I have a pro-business party. Now, it would be really hard to argue that a hands-on party is not necessarily pro-business. Like CEOs are generally pro-business. But for this, I actually just picked people who had core knowledge of finance or economics.
Including accounting?
Including accounting.
Okay.
And they sit on the boards of high earner companies.
And there are a lot of these. We see, because in our knowledge database, we see a lot of these.
In fact, when I did this a couple of ways, including generational birth dates, like are you a Gen Xer, a millennial, a boomer? I did it through administrations, how long you've been on the board. Are you an Obama, original board, or have you been on the board since Bush Senior? I looked at this in a number of different ways, and when I came to the permutations of things, right, like who sits on boards right now, unsurprisingly, in the U.S., the number one group of people are boomers, and they actually have business knowledge, right? Like they have a background in finance and economics. 42% or 43% of U.S. directors have a background in finance and economics. That's exceptionally high number.
Yeah.
But that reflects sort of the potential ideology of investors and what they think matters on boards.
Sure.
They want people who are pro-business, who have core knowledge of economics. So I made the pro-business party, and those are people who obviously they're not on the hands-on party or the elite party. Really all they have is core knowledge of finance and economics and high-earning company boards.
And I'm guessing this would be a pretty popular party based on the data you just presented, that there are so many of them. I mean,
you would think.
In a parliamentary system, I'm guessing that if you use the United States as an example, if to say there were Democrats and Republicans and then 6 other parties, the pro-business party would be up there as one of the 2 big parties.
Well, here's the rest of them.
Yeah.
There's the STEM party, which is like pro-business, only the core knowledge is STEM and they have an advanced degree.
Yeah.
Now they don't have to have core knowledge of the industry that they're in. They don't have to have been CEOs. These can be academics.
Smarty pants.
These are just like science, technology people with advanced degrees who are none of the other parties so far.
And I would say with the rise of cybersecurity concerns, AI, I would think every board needs someone from the STEM party, frankly.
Which is fascinating when you don't see it that much, right?
Yeah.
The next one was a network party. These are people with just a powerful network of friends. They don't meet any of the other criteria. They just have powerful friends.
A frat boy, just a friendly,
highly connected
party thrower.
Party throwers. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
CEO party. This is just, were you a CEO? And this in the United States is actually a very big deal. I had to make this so low on the list because in the U.S., if I made it the first thing on the list, it would just be every director. Every director would just be a CEO for the most part.
That point is well taken. I was just looking at SK Group, a Korean company, I believe, have just announced 4 new board chairs. They all happen to be women. But one thing I noticed that looking at their backgrounds is that they're not looking necessarily at just being a CEO as the most important skill set to run a board, right? There was a former judge in there. There are just all kinds of types in there, not necessarily just CEOs.
The European boards are similar. The CEOs are not as prevalent on European boards. They exist, but they're not as prevalent. And then there's 2 more. I have a core knowers party, which is they just have core knowledge of this industry.
Which is important, yeah.
Which is important. And then finally, an unaffiliated. There were leftovers, and I just said, okay, you're unaffiliated for now.
Right?
You're basically an independent of some kind. You don't have any. You didn't hit any of these marks.
I have to say, I'm oddly loving this party system, but yeah, go ahead.
So then I wanted to use it in practice. So let's look at you mentioned the 5 boards that you looked at: Cooper, Photronics, TD SYNNEX, Schlumberger, and Hewlett Packard. I looked at exactly those companies, and I wanted to say, well, what parties are represented? And if you were voting a party, which one might you want to vote for at these companies, right? Like, where might you lean? There was only 1 new director of the 5 boards in this week's sample. The rest of them are all re-ups. They're all incumbents and re-ups. The new director is named Ken Lamneck at TD SYNNEX. He actually he's a boomer. He's got business and safety, security, transportation as core knowledge sets. He's 570 TSR batter on 2 other boards, 229 earnings, so not great. He was part of the hands-on party. When I was done looking through everything, he's a hands-on party.
Okay.
So I included him, adding him to the TD SYNNEX board to show you what the mix might be. So here's the way to vote party. And I ran this for every active director right now. So this is not something that I did just for these 5 companies. Every director in our database, we ran it for. If you were to vote, the company of the 5 that is the most balanced between party representation is Photronics.
Okay.
In fact, on Photronics, they have hands-on, pro-business, STEM, CEO, core knowledge, and unaffiliated. Almost every party, except for the ones that you might actually be a little concerned about, the elites and the networked. This is not a highly networked board. It is not like about elite status. This is about people who have done the job, know the job, get it done. They have the largest representation on the Photronics board was core knowledge, just core knowledge.
Interesting. I will add that according to the performance data, Photronics also doing very well overall. Hitting 737 overall, which is really extremely high.
That's very high.
913 in earnings, 600 in total shareholder return. This is a high performing board.
They were also the only company of this group that had a STEM contingent. Not a single other company of these 5 had one representative who was a part of the STEM party. That was their party.
The only one.
Most elitist board.
Yes.
Schlumberger. 60% of the board members were elitists according to this methodology.
What's your takeaway about having an elitist board? Is there a takeaway?
So these are people that basically have advanced degrees or went to elite schools. They've been on multiple boards and they have a powerful network of friends.
All that could be good, right?
All of that could be absolutely good. But it also is a little bit myopic, right? Like
sure.
You're sort of limiting yourself to powerful people who went to elite schools is not exactly should not necessarily be the baseline indicator for whether or not you should be on a board. These are not people who have core knowledge of the industry. These are not, they may have knowledge that's useful, but a company like Schlumberger, the thing that struck me when I looked at actually their knowledge breakdown is they don't have anyone on that board with core knowledge of the industry that they're in. That seems like an oversight, right? Like that seems like something you would want as an energy company. HP similarly was highly elite. 50% of the board, half the board were elitists as well.
Right, and the difference, I will say, the initial difference that I'm seeing between this party system and a regular democratic political party system is that you wouldn't necessarily want to vote all of one party onto this board, right? I mean, I would think that having one representative from each party might make the best board, right? That's just an initial thought here.
So when I get to recommendations, my initial recommendation was balance. But I do think if you thought it through, if you're an investor, what do you really want out of your board members?
Right.
I think hands-on party might be the most important thing. I think you would want to skew towards people who have been CEOs in the industry and have been through a recession and weathered that storm.
Yes, a skew within reason, right? I mean, you don't want to have it to be overwhelming.
I'm not saying 80%.
Right.
I'm saying 30, 40%, right?
And look, what this party system also gives you is the opportunity to evaluate the board that already exists, too, because rarely are investors asked to reconstruct a board from scratch, right? So you could actually you could target 1 or 2 members to replace just to create that balance you're seeking.
So in that vein, Cooper Companies actually stood out because 38% of their board was tagged as hands-on, and 38% were tagged as elite.
Now, that seems pretty heavy. So you're saying almost 80% of the board is either hands-on party or elite party. That
correct.
Seems like a lot.
Correct. So there's a heavy contingent of representation of just 2 parties there. It's a 2-party system, effectively.
Yeah.
At Cooper Companies.
It's funny. It's funny, and I'll get to this later. But Cooper Company is the company I highlighted in my recommendations. But go ahead.
We'll go to the vote recommendations now, so we don't belabor the party system point. but here's a way to apply it. And again, this
Yes.
is all sort of a conceptual.
I love it.
You could do it. The data's all there, but refinement is probably necessary over time. Let's start with Schlumberger, where if you had the goal of some sort of parity between the parties, you would break up the elites. This would be simple to do because what I did was I filtered the directors by what parties that they were in. And I looked at the elite party, and there were two that stood out as sort of obvious to actually vote against anyway. And they were Jim Hackett and Leupold. These are two directors who are the weakest performers on the board overall. Hackett is actually on 4 boards overall. He's got plenty to do. He's not going to miss being on the Schlumberger board if you were to vote him out.
Sure.
And he's the oldest of the group of elites. So you're getting rid of longer tenured, multi-boarding, weak performers. It actually is sort of an easy layup when you use it alongside multiple data points. And this is a board that does not have STEM knowledge, as we talked about, and they have redundant technical skills. When I looked at the skills of the board, you would recoup 14% of the influence on the board by voting out these 2 directors, and that would give you the ability to fill it with STEM or core knowledge party replacements and balance yourself a little bit. So that's like one example, just looking at one company where you could slate effectively and say, I am pro-business, or I'm pro-STEM, or I'm pro-hands-on. There's not enough of that here. I will vote against directors who don't fill those parties that I'm looking for. Here's another one. You want me to do another one?
Sure.
Let's do HP. Because
Okay.
HP is a governance masterclass in basically gaming the rule book that's been set up by ISS and Glass Lewis. They have not one director over 10 years of tenure. The 6 longest tenured directors are at 9.5 years each, and they are split 50-50 male-female. Mm-hmm. They have basically mastered the art of looking like every governance paper's dream, right? Like they're breaking up. There's strong representation. There's no super long tenured directors. 2/3 of this board actually has on paper core knowledge of the industry, and 50% have business backgrounds on top of it. So on paper, this is an unimpeachable board. However, they are also super connected. This is a heavy elite board, and network didn't even pop because elite took over. But when I looked at the elite party on the board, there were some obvious directors, including Pat Russo, Charles Noski, and Pamela Carter. Carter is 75 years old. There's no retirement age at the company, but she's going to hit year 10 in tenure anyway, and she's heavily connected. Noski's connected and elite. He has no overlap in a necessary skill. He's one of the people that doesn't have a necessary skill. And Pat Russo, she's hands-on, but she is also connected to more than 50% of this board, either through other boards or nonprofit boards that she sits on.
Okay.
There was one more. I looked at TD SYNNEX breaking up the Networker Party,
Sure.
Which is easy, where Hao Lee and Dennis Polk, they both been at the company for 13 years. Lee is 71 years old. He's on the Networker Party. He could be a vote no. And Kathy Krusko is Networker Party on 2 other boards. You could vote no there. And then everything at Photronics and Cooper was a vote yes for me, with the caveat at Cooper that they're missing STEM party, but vote yes for the directors. But you had something different for Cooper.
Well, no, and this is why I love this data, because there's so many different ways to use the data as an investor. I love the party system that you're presenting here. And let's talk about Cooper, because I use the data from a different perspective. So Cooper companies, out of the 5 companies that we're covering this week, by far the worst CEO pay ratio of all the companies, 394-1 for Albert White III. So you know that I'm voting against all say on pay this year, that the CEO is making more than the median worker on day one. But beyond that, they had one of the highest gender influence gaps I've seen at a company that's not controlled, and that's minus 30%. So what does this mean? The board is actually half women. So they're appointing women, but the women have no influence. The women only have 21% of influence, and that's because the board is absolutely being dominated by the chair and the former CEO, Robert Weiss. So this is an easy scenario for me where I don't need a current CEO and a former CEO. So you target Weiss and his influence, and you could replace it with man or woman. But no, actually, I think you want to replace it with a powerful woman. And to your point, Matt, someone from STEM, someone with STEM experience, right? You can use the data. You can connect these two thoughts. So that's what I saw at Cooper Companies. The only other thing I wanted to point out before we wrap up this week is I wanted to tip my hat to John Chevedden. John actually has the only shareholder proposals up this week at these 5 companies. He does two times in fact. One at Hewlett Packard, asking for a transparency and lobbying report, and one at TD SYNNEX, asking for the shareholder ability to call for special shareholder meetings. So nothing from any of the anti-woke proponents, just John Chevedden stepping up. So Matt, do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I'd be curious if anybody is listening to this. I'd be curious thoughts on how you would do a sort of party system for directors. I think there's a lot of opportunity to change the system and semi-mechanize
so
it.
many opportunities,
where including coming up with actual party organizations that could begin to vet directors over time. But in the absence of that, in that infrastructure, using the data to do it, how would you do it?
The thing I love about this, Matt, initially is there are two things that stand out to me. One is it's yet another way of articulating your choices as an investor, right? The other thing is that the information presented by the companies themselves it's unusable. It's often a matrix of skills and experiences. Every director basically has like everything checked. There is no way for an investor to see through that mess and to articulate anything really, to understand who the directors are. So affiliating them with a party and something that makes sense. Like when I hear STEM party, when I hear network party, they're very intuitive names. I can at least understand who this director might be. I think it's a great first step to articulating your choices as an investor. But that's all I have. I know, Matt, you're done. That's the Proxy Countdown for the week of March 24th, 2025. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool. Forever on the lookout for shareholder shenanigans, dopey directors, scandalous CEO pay ratios, and Matt, for you, looking for those wayward floating band-aids. It's disgusting. Band-aids.